The last exam that we gave, I realized that there were some people, or a lot of you, who had trouble with the human factor kind of questions about, for example, fatigue, chronic versus acute. So I've decided to go over that material again because it will appear on the final exam, and you're going to need to know about it, at least to the extent that when the question comes up, you won't be surprised. Also, I want to point out that when you take an exam, especially with the FAA, and it says, what are the things that you should be doing without, and it gives you a choice between prescription and non-prescription or both, you're always going to choose both, right? Because a non-over-the-counter like NyQuil probably has enough in it so that if you took the recommended dose and then tried to fly an airplane or a drone, you might find yourself all over the sky. So the answers to a lot of the questions that the FAA is going to ask you are, and that we're going to ask you, are to acknowledge that nearly any medication you take, perhaps with the exception of a standard aspirin, is going to have some kind of an effect on you in some way that will lessen your ability to fly safely. Human factors is something that, even though you're not flying an airplane, you're still responsible for flying a drone. And as a result of being responsible, if anything happens, you're the guy or gal who is going to have to answer to somebody unless you have done enough to make sure that everything that's done by your crew is safe. You already know that you do not need a medical certificate to fly a drone. Just as there are new rules today in aviation called Med B, I believe it is, where even pilots do not have to go to a certified medical examiner to get a medical certificate. And that just occurred within the last year. So there are a lot of pilots are opting not to fly with a regular medical certificate, but instead they go to their local doctor. The local doctor looks at them and says, yeah, I guess you're still alive. Okay, you're okay to fly. It's not quite that easy, but the fact is that if you're in a reasonable normal health, you'll be able to fly without having a medical certificate, and the same is true in drone flying. And it's always the case, whether it's drone flying, driving a car, or flying an airplane, if you are not up to it because you feel bad, because you're dizzy, because you have a sinus headache, because your ears are plugged up, all of those factors that would in some way or another cause you to be less than safe operating any kind of machinery, whether it's an airplane or a car or a drone, don't do it. It's not worth the risk. And you can see a lot of medicines that are even prescribed that are normally you would say, well, this is not a big deal. It's just a pill to keep me from having tooth pain after my dentist visit. The fact is that in many cases, the pharmacy will put a label on there that says, do not operate machinery for some period of time after taking these pills. The point is that if you're going to be responsible, especially if you're going to be responsible for driving friends in your car somewhere for whatever reason, even if it's around the block to the local meat market or the store, it's not worth doing it if you don't feel good, or if you've had a beer, or if you've had a cocktail or something of that nature. It will never pay in the long run. And that means that you not only need to know what's wrong with you, you need to know what it can affect. A sinus headache would always affect the inner ear, right? And if it affects the inner ear, you lose stability. You start feeling like you're getting dizzy, like you don't have the right kind of balance, like things are not like they should be. Things don't seem right. Inner ears, in terms of flight, are the toughest ones to deal with. If you're a drone pilot, or if you're just the pilot in command of a drone operation, you have more leeway, you have more latitude in terms of saying, okay, well, I can at least be the pilot in command. I may not be able to fly the drone because I have somebody operating it for me. Let's say something happened and you broke a finger or something, and literally you couldn't pick up and fly that drone, but you were there to supervise and get paid to watch the program being done. In that particular case, that would not be a big deal. It would not be a problem. You have to make that assessment yourself. The FAA is putting the onus on you to decide whether or not you are capable of being the PIC, maybe not even touching it, maybe not being the visual observer. You're just there as the PIC. Are you healthy enough to be a good PIC and to remember all the factors that you have to? And that's true, too, if in the middle of a session you start getting sick from perhaps from something you ate 2 or 3 hours before that, or if you start getting dizzy for no apparent reason, it's your responsibility to terminate the session or not start it at all, depending how you feel. If you know somebody like yourself that has a pilot license, maybe somebody in the classroom here that you can call and say, hey, come on out here and take over as PIC. I can't because I'm getting sick. That's one way to do it, is to provide a stand-in for yourselves. So you need to keep in touch with one another if you know that your fellow classmate has also gotten their remote pilot license, because someday you may need to call on them to help you out. Or you may be so busy with making money as a PIC that somebody keeps calling you and saying, when can you come out here and be here? And your answer is, I'm booked for the next 6 weeks. Well, it's your responsibility then, in my opinion, to call a friend, to call a classmate that's been in here with you that you know got their remote license. And if they're anywhere near in the vicinity, which means in the Central Valley, let them go out and make money. That endears you to the person who was after you to be the PIC, but because you couldn't, you provided a substitute. That's the kind of way that you do well in business, is you don't just say, no, I can't be there, and let it go at that. You can say, no, I can't be there, but I will make sure someone is there. These known conditions, and you know they're going to affect the human body, are very simple, and we're going to enumerate them here, right? And they have to do with things that we talked about before, that have to do with hypoxia, hyperventilation, fatigue, dizziness, dehydration, any of those factors that pilots themselves have to deal with, you do too. Not because they will affect you in the same way, but because they will be there and they will be prevalent, and they might have an effect on you that you're not aware of. So when you're asked on the exam about various conditions, I want you to at least know the basic of the condition. That is, if you have a particular condition like hyperinflation, and we'll cover that here in a minute, if you have a condition like that, you want to know not only what effect it has on you, but how you can deal with it. Because questions on the exam are going to be questions like, here are the symptoms, what do you have? That would be a typical question. Or, here's what you have, what can you do to get rid of it? So we'll cover that here in a minute. And hyperventilation, it happens to a lot of people because they get stressed out. And hyperventilation is a rapid breathing. What you're doing is you're exhausting all of the carbon dioxide out of your lungs. And that's not a good thing, because the carbon dioxide in your lungs triggers the body's need for more oxygen. So if you get rid of it by breathing too rapidly because you're scared or you're anxious or you're afraid of something or you're stressed out or you're in a situation you don't know how to deal with it and it's kind of critical, those are the kind of things that would create hyperinflation. Hyperventilation. Just remember what it's going to do to you, it's going to overcome you in some way to the point where you might even lose consciousness. Sometimes when you're out flying around or you're preparing to fly a drone, you may not be aware that you're under an emotional stress or other kinds of stress. Maybe you didn't study about something the night before. You know there's a big test in the morning. You're all stressed out because of it. That may not be a good time to be acting as pilot in command for a drone operation. Remember, you're the person that looks at yourself. And there was a question on one of these previous exams that we had where it said, who's responsible? And the answer was the pilot. And who's responsible for the pilot being able to perform a PIC operation? And the answer was the pilot, right? I've seen this happen a lot with student pilots, power pilots in particular, especially if we're going to go out and do stalls that day, or whether we're going to do spins or anything that puts a lot of emotional or physical stress on a pilot or a student pilot. They start getting hyperventilated. And it's pretty easy to calm them down, and it's pretty easy to solve the problem. And we'll talk about that in a minute. In this particular case, but you can overcome the symptoms fairly easily. It's just that you have to know what's happening to you. That's the reason that we're going through this now, is so that you know what's happening to you, so that you can select the most appropriate way of overcoming it. And in the case of hyperventilation, one of the funny things is you breathe into a paper bag. Why do you think that's the case? Yeah, that's correct. You're breathing into the bag, so you're exhaling carbon dioxide, and you're breathing a lot of that back into your lungs. So you're restoring the carbon dioxide in your lungs, which is a crucial need. It's a trigger mechanism, and without it, your body is going to start getting rid of, or it's going to start lacking oxygen, because your body is not triggering it, saying, "Hey, I need more breathing into my lungs." And also slowing down the breathing rate, trying to get away from being stressful. One of the nice parts about teaching women to fly aircraft is because they're a little bit more honest about their feelings than men are. Men tend to say, if I look at them, they'll tend to say, "Oh yeah, I'm fine." And I know they're not. I know they're all stressed out, and they're probably starting to hyperventilate. But my female students would immediately say, "Hey, I'm scared. I don't want to do this anymore. Let's take a break. Let's go back." And that's what makes it so nice to be able to get that honest feedback coming back from a student pilot. That's the way I want you all to be with yourselves. I want you to be as honest with yourselves as possible when it comes to any condition you feel is not right. Stop where you are, examine the condition, think about what has happened, and then try to overcome it. And I mentioned to you before, I think sometime way back in the introduction to aviation, but it's even more important now, and that is dehydration, in my opinion, is the most insidious of the things that can happen to you either in flight or on the ground. And it's because you don't know it's happening. In a minute, we're going to cover hypoxia, and you know that hypoxia is an absence of oxygen in the system. But dehydration is an absence of liquids, an absence of fluids in your system. And I had some personal experiences with people who were flying over the Owens Valley in a glider, 3 people flying in a glider together, and one of the guys in the glider group took off and headed away from the group, started doing all kinds of crazy maneuvers for a period of 15 minutes, and then he rejoined the glider group that were flying down the Owens Valley. And I remember one of them, Mario, saying, "John, what in the world were you doing?" And John said, I was doing nothing. I was just here all the time." Well, of course he wasn't. He was doing some really weird things. So he was hallucinating, and later on he admitted that he was so thirsty and he forgot to bring enough water with him in the glider. He got to the point where dehydration made him do things that were even worse than what would happen if you had hypoxia. So dehydration to me is very insidious because you cannot tell other than the fact that you're thirsty. But I'm thirsty right now. I could use a glass of water, but that doesn't mean I'm dehydrated. So it's one of those conditions of the body that is that is very, very subtle, and it can come up on you very quickly. And in fact, it does cause hallucinations and fatigue and short-term amnesia. So in my particular flight training, I do not allow my students to go up on a glider by themselves without at least 2 bottles of water, and they're not allowed to stay up more than an hour. So they have enough water to be able to continue to drink it while they're flying it for a period of 1 hour, at which time if they run out of water, they are required to come to land. And that's because if they stay up any longer without water, I know what's going to happen to them. So you make sure that whatever you do, you remain hydrated. And just in general, as a general health process, should always drink enough water so that your body doesn't have to worry about screaming for it in some way. Yeah. And you saw from the last exam we had that there will be questions on, especially on fatigue, and there'll probably be questions on hyperventilation. I don't know about hypoxia because we'll cover that in a minute, and I'll show you why I'm not entirely sure that there will be questions on hypoxia, but for the time being, just consider that's one of the factors we have to look at. Okay, fatigue. And these are words that come right out of the FAA manual. That is, continues to be one of the most treacherous hazards to flight safety. That is word for word out of the Federal Aviation Regulation book. It's the FAR-AIM book, big thick book that I suggest if you're going to be in the business of aviation, you buy one. They're about $15, $16, $17 or $20 if you want to pay more profit to somebody. And remember that on the previous test we had, there were questions about fatigue and about whether it was chronic or acute. And so the FAA, in their wisdom, they defined fatigue as being one of the two, acute or chronic. And I know that we briefly covered this in discussions, but we didn't pay enough attention to it, and so on that previous exam, most of you got caught by the definition of acute versus chronic. But surprisingly, as I mentioned before, 13 of you passed the exam if it was an FAA exam. So we'll look at acute and chronic here and say that acute fatigue is a short-term condition. You know, fatigue by itself, that means you're tired, right? But, you know, by the time the middle of the day comes along, or at the end of the day, most of us are a little tired. So maybe we're a little fatigued, but we're not acutely fatigued, and hopefully we're not chronically fatigued. So just remember, acute is a short-term condition. And if you want to try to remember a mnemonic for that, just remember A, acute, and that is at the moment. A, at the moment. Some way, you should decide for yourself, some way of deciding how you can distinguish between acute and chronic. Chronic is a long-term condition. So C, I would say continuous as a way to remember chronic. So A is at the moment, and C would be continuous. That's a way to distinguish between acute and chronic. And because they appeared a couple of times on that last exam we took, my guess is it will definitely appear on the FAA exam at the end of the semester. They certainly will on the practice exams we'll take during the week of the 4th. Or the 3rd, whatever it is. 3rd. So just keep in mind the FAA is particularly interested in the definition of fatigue and so in this particular case, acute These are words that are taken right out of the FAA manual, word for word. And again, acute means you can say at the moment, or you can say, I don't know what else. Maybe somebody has a suggestion about what else to use for a mnemonic. But I would say probably at the moment is a good idea, because it doesn't last a long time. You get tired after you've worked hard during the day. That's not chronic fatigue, that's acute fatigue. It's interesting how the FAA has taken a lot of the information that has been presented to pilots and tested in knowledge tests at various levels of pilot development, and now have modified it so that it applies to remote pilot. And it's a good idea, definitely a good idea. It's a way to make sure that you live up to certain degrees of standards when it comes to yourself and being capable of flying a drone safely, or at least being able to oversee or supervise drone operations. Chronic fatigue. Again, these are words, not my words. These are words directly out of the FAA manual. And so if these words appear here, they may likely appear on exams that you might be taking over the next week or two. Not enough time for full recovery between episodes of acute fatigue. And so what happens with chronic fatigue? Well, chronic fatigue, if it happens all the time and it's continually a part of your whole life, where you're chronically fatigued, then it's going to have an effect on judgment. It's going to have an effect on a lot of things you do in your life. It's probably going to have an effect on your emotional status. You may not be getting along with your boyfriend or girlfriend. You may be getting angry at your parents, and you shouldn't. There are lots of things that happen between human beings, not because they have trouble with one another, but because one or the other or both of them are either fatigued, or they're dealing with some kind of an illness that they don't understand, or something like that. So just keep in mind that these things don't only happen to you as a remote pilot, they happen to you as a human being. And so the answer, of course, is pretty simple. If you're chronically fatigued, you better be chronically rested. So just think in terms of what I would consider to be the antidote to being chronically fatigued is to be chronically rested. Now, some of you may have parents who tell you to get out of the bed. You're spending more time sleeping. Come on down here and get some work done. I can appreciate that. But really the answer is that you want to make sure you get a minimum number of hours of sleep. And when you're young, I think that number is like 9 and 10 hours a night. As we get older, we need less sleep. I think it's 8 for me, 7 or 8 for me. That good old factor called stress. And stress in aviation, I can tell you where stress comes from. I've seen more examples of stress in an airplane, but it's understandable. I remember being pretty stressed out when I first did my pilot training. I had a really gruff old flight instructor, Kermit Anderson. He was a World War II pilot and a Corsair. And boy, was he tough. I remember one time when we did stall, first time we did a stall, and there were, inside the airplane, there were tubular things. It was an old airplane. There were some tubular things up here at the top of the cockpit. So he pulls the nose up, and we did a stall, and the airplane drops, right? My first reaction was to let go of everything and grab these two pieces of tubular steel. I thought to myself, wait a minute, that tubular steel is going down as well. What am I doing grabbing a hold of it? Oh, did he get angry. Get your hands off it! He's yelling at me, banging my shoulder. So from that point on, I reluctantly hung on to the stick when we did stalls. But I remember looking up at those two things and thinking, boy, that was comforting at the moment. Anyway, it was a little funny. But again, stress. Stress makes you do funny things. And so you want to be careful about being overstressed. That's exactly right. It can impair pilot performance. There I was. I took my hands off the stick and everything, and grabbed those two pieces of tubular steel, which had absolutely nothing to do with flying the airplane. But there I was, hanging on them, thinking, well, if the plane goes down, I'm not going along with it. Stress can also make you have a difficult time thinking. You know, when you get stressed out. That's why one of the tips of taking exams is to be comfortable, relaxed, don't get overstressed. Just say to yourself, if you don't get 100, it doesn't matter. It's okay if you try to get 100. It's okay if you want to be the perfect student. But if you're not, don't be stressed over it. Accept that maybe there's a reason why you may not wind up getting an A on every exam or a B. So don't go into an exam all stressed out, because it's not going to do you any good, and in fact it's going to be a negative to your trying to achieve a good score. And stress will also impede many of the things that you do during the day. It might impede you remembering things. Like your mother told you to do something on the way home, but you forgot to do it because you were all stressed out because you didn't get a good enough mark on the exam in Flight 104. Sure. And these are things that I'm sure all of you have experienced in some way, some of them. I'm sure that you've all been stressed out at one point in time. Pardon? Yeah. So just be aware of the fact that you don't want to bring stress into your lives if it's not there. You don't want to bring it into an exam. You don't want to bring it to a remote pilot operation. Just try to get it out of your mind, get away from it. Hypoxia, it's not likely. I don't think that there will be questions on hypoxia in the remote pilot exam, because hypoxia is a high altitude kind of thing. The only place that I can think of, you guys want to listen or do you want to talk? The only place I can think of where hypoxia might come into effect is where you're at a high altitude airport on a very hot day and you want to fly your drone. So where would that be? Well, it could be Lake Tahoe. It could be Truckee, the airport at Truckee. It could be anywhere in the high deserts. It could be Las Vegas area on a day when it's 115. You yourself might have a problem with oxygen, but probably not. Okay? You just need to be aware that if you're in a high, hot place, you need to be careful, because it's a condition that will interfere with all kinds of functions in your body. It has caused a number of major aircraft accidents where people have gotten high in jets, in business jets. There was one indication where one of the more famous golfers in the world was being chartered from one course to another. They got up to altitude. Something went wrong with the oxygen system in the Learjet. As it continued on under autopilot, everybody in the jet died. And it was only a matter of where the aircraft was going to wind up landing or crashing. There have been instances where a guy on a Cessna went out over the Atlantic Ocean because when the interceptor jets got next to him, they could see that he had passed out in the cockpit. And there was no way that he was going to survive because the airplane kept flying until it ran out of fuel, and then it crashed into the ocean. Lots of instances where aircraft have been high and had trouble with the oxygen systems, and everybody aboard died. Keep in mind, there may be a question about this particular thing here, it occurs at altitude. It's not because there's less oxygen up there, but remember the percentage of oxygen, of 21% oxygen in the air, is the same up at altitude as it is on the ground. Same. It's the fact that there's not as much pressure up there to be able to force the oxygen across the alveoli, the membranes in your lungs, in order for you to get that oxygen into your blood. So it's going to be as a result of the lack of pressure, not the lack of oxygen by itself. Not sure, but I think there's going to be a question on the exam because of that. Yes, it can affect you. You can get a little dizzy if it's really hot and you're at a high altitude airport. Maybe in Rifle, Colorado, or someplace in Colorado. I forget. There's an airport that's like 9,500 feet, and on a hot summer day, the density altitude could be easily 13,000 feet. So you need to know about hypoxia in case there's a question about it, but I don't think it's going to be significant because it is not really effective for drone pilots, even if you are at a high altitude, hot airport. One of the questions on the exam that we had was how to position yourself so that you could minimize the comfort, minimize the discomfort for your crew, or so that you could get rid of the glare off the snow so you'd be able to see the drone better. Right. Well, remember, your vision is to see your drone at all times, to be able to deal with it. Where is it? How is it performing? And if that means that you have to shift the whole crew around in some way so that you take advantage of the texture or the depth perception or the sun glare or whatever, you need to do that. So your best bet is to think in terms of the safety in the operation of the drone and not necessarily the comfort level of the crew standing on the ground. If it's a real hazy day and the drone starts getting beyond 1 mile, but you can still see the mountains that are more than a mile away, so you're legally okay because you can see the mountains that are more than 3 miles away, but now that little drone's kind of disappearing into the haze. In that case, you should just turn it around and bring it back again. Unless you have a very substantial drone that has all kinds of features and software where it can operate on it by itself, or it can go to a prescribed path, or in the event that you lose control in some way that it will go into some sort of lost link or some sort of lost control and come back to you. I don't know. I'm not that familiar with the software. I think Mrs. Van Dam probably knows a lot more, and I think Jordy does too. So we have two people in the room that have a lot of experience with drones, more so than I do. Okay, so now I'm just going to take very quickly for the next few minutes, I'm going to go over quickly the review, and this again, it comes right out of the FAA manual. These items, these elements that I'm going to be listing are elements that are in print in the federal regulations. All right? Okay, so the initial knowledge test that you're going to, perhaps some of you are going to take in December, cover these areas. The regulations relating to small aircraft, unmanned aircraft systems. And, you know, part of our lectures have been to address these particular areas. So if you have already taken notes, sit back and relax, go ahead, because I'm going to go through them one after another, but not in detail. I'm going to finish before 3 o'clock. Aerospace classification, we did A, B, C, D, and E, and G. We went through that, and we went through operating requirements, flight restrictions, 3 miles visibility, no higher than 400 feet unless you're next to a structure, weather sources. I hope all of you are continuing to call the ATIS at Reedley and the ATIS at FAT. Get used to listening to them, because it's going to give you information on weather that you can use for yourself and your parents, but at the same time it'll get you used to hearing information that is being spoken to you about wind, wind direction, temperature, visibility, all the things that you need to know as a remote pilot in command, Because someday you're going to be asked to go to an orchard somewhere around here, and they're going to say, now, are you familiar with the weather? You're going to say, yes, I just called to read the ATIS, and I got the following pieces of information. And then we talked about small unmanned aircraft loading, and that is you don't want to overload the aircraft. And if the manufacturer doesn't have a restriction, which they should, then you have to be the one to decide whether the camera that you just bought, this big old bulky Canon camera, is going to be more weight than your poor little drone can lift up. Emergency procedures. You know, you need to know what to do in the event of any kind of emergency that might arise. And we've covered a lot of this. Radio communication procedures. You need to know how to talk to air traffic control. You need to know how to broadcast on what is called CTAF, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. And what is it at Reedley? Does anybody remember what the frequency is at Reedley for the Common Traffic Advisory? Nobody remembers, huh? Okay. Look it up. Okay, you also need to determine the performance of the unmanned aircraft. Well, one of the items of performance is how long will the battery last, right? And how much can you carry, and will it hover, and does it obey its software signals you give it, or does it obey left and right turns that you give it from the control box? Physiological effects of drugs and alcohol. Now, you know that drones don't drink, right? They also don't take drugs. But if there are drugs on board and you know about it, what happens? Big trouble, right? If you know about it and there are drugs on board, you are liable. And aeronautical decision-making and good judgment. And that is, you have to make decisions probably almost on a minute-by-minute basis about whether or not the drone's being flown by the person who owns the drone, and you're just there to be paid to be the PIC. Airport operations. Again, it's something I think just in the most recent lecture on Monday or Tuesday we talked about airport operations and how to deal with air traffic control and how to deal with the markings on the airport and what lines you cross and what lines you don't cross. And then finally, the end is maintenance and pre-flight inspection procedures. So if you have made notes of this review, those are the areas that you're going to be tested on. Right. Any questions? I know, because you want to go home. So you'll hold the question until tomorrow, right? I understand that. All right, everybody. Thank you. See you tomorrow.